Chapter 6. Whom the Gods Love Die Young. Porter returned to the shambles to find the shop shrouded in darkness. Her foot was on the bottom step when she heard clicking. It was coming from the storeroom. "Etty," she called out. The air chilled in response. Porter hesitated before going to pry. The handle felt clammy as she opened the door. The clicking grew louder. An outside light grazed the former resident who was absorbed in her knitting. She had traded the alcove for a window seat. Porter shivered. The room was freezing. Completing her row, the spectre held up her needles to inspect her handiwork. The shapelet garment did little for Porter, but the knitter appeared satisfied. She considered the ill-lit yard a moment before starting a new row. Footsteps overhead stilled the wraith's hands. Her eyes darted to the ceiling as she stood. Sensing what was coming, Porter tried to move, but the shadow was too quick. Her lungs froze as the ghost passed through her and into the shop. Etty came down to collect till receipts and was perturbed to hear someone gasping in the storeroom. She should have fled upstairs, bolted the door and phoned the police, but her feet had other ideas. "Porter," she cried, on discovering her flatmate slumped against the wall. She rushed over to help, then retracted as if burnt. "You're glacial, darling." "Hang on a minute." Etty left the room, returning moments later with a blanket. Throwing it around Porter, she helped her to the sitting room and set about lighting the fire. "Drink this, darling. It'll thaw you out." Etty pressed a glass into Porter's shaking hand and joined her on the sofa. She waited for the whiskey to take effect before asking why she'd been in the storeroom. "I heard a noise and went to check. I came over all funny," lied Porter, telling her she'd missed lunch. Etty offered to make dinner. Porter was dozing when the smoke alarm interrupted. She found Etty beating the kitchen ceiling with a tea towel. Her flatmate, soon tiring of such sport, resorted to removing the batteries instead. "You don't need to pretend," said Porter, when Etty tried her hand with a peeler. "Pretend, darling?" "That you can cook." "I can cook, darling." "You hold a peeler the other way," smiled Porter. She dodged the towel. Porter was returning to the sofa when a squeal drew her to the window. A ghost tour was underway. The guide was monopolising the doorway to regale his audience with the more sordid side of the shambles. A raspberry velvet cape fringed with frills completed the drama. The door behind him was suddenly wrenched open by a man wearing a dressing gown. "It's every sodding night," the man fumed. Small ears were hastily covered when the guide gave as good as he got. Someone filming the tour on their phone realised they'd hit gold. A student in Taiwan chanced upon the live performance, while it was a smash hit in Chile 6 hours later. Arguing led to shoving, and then the ripping of velvet. The first punch resulted in blood, the second, an exodus. Etty strayed upon her flatmate hanging out of the window. "Don't worry, darling, I won't make you eat it." "Who's screaming?" Etty joined Porter at the window. "Sid! Sid! Set that poor man down, darling, and close your door." "But it's every night," moaned Etty's neighbour, dabbing his bloody nose with a handful of velvet. "No one's forcing you to live here, mate," argued the guide. "And no one's forcing you to work here, mate." The raspberry was in peril of becoming preserve. Fortunately for him, luck came in the form of 2 police officers. "What's going on here?" asked the burlier of the two. "Show's over," said Etty, fastening the window. She went to get her stash of takeaway menus. The tired potatoes could rest easy for another day. 2 hours and 1 Chinese feast later, and Porter could no longer move. The shambles was finally quiet, allowing incorporeal beings to roam unmolested. It wasn't until a drunk chanced upon the cobbles and felt inspired to serenade the gloom. Spectres made a quick exit, along with any wildlife looting the bins. The virtuosa eventually stumbled down its nickel way, and peace returned. Etty rolled up a homegrown cigarette. She took a long drag before offering it to Porter. Porter declined. Second-hand smoke was enough. Etty's eyes grew heavy. Porter thought she was asleep until she asked again why she'd been in the storeroom. Porter stuck to her lie. Etty surveyed her through a veil of smoke. "You look shot, darling. You're working too hard." "You sound like my mother," said Porter darkly. Etty smiled. "She's wise too." Wise was not the word Porter associated with her mother. She told Etty about a case she was working on in Haxby. Sue said Mike wanted it, so I pulled rank. No wonder he dislikes you, chortled Etty, up to speed with Mike's unique brand of charm. He can't help being a toad, darling. He's a man. Your ex wasn't a prince, then? Asked Porter. Etty's expression said it all. Her experience of matrimony had been a brief one. I was never under any illusion about Tim, darling, and our relationship is much improved since he moved in with Tracy. She owns a flower shop at the bottom of the shambles. It's very amicable. Indulging in the soap opera, Porter asked if Tim had had an affair. No, darling, I did. Oh, Mother wore that same expression when I told her. It only lasted 6 months, though. I consulted the crystals and they said Tracy and I should just be friends. Tracy disagreed, of course, but what else could I do? Stop listening to rocks, murmured Porter. What can I say, darling? It's a weakness of mine. Anyway, Tracy turned to Tim for comfort, and the relationship blossomed. So the tale has a happy ending after all. Porter's life felt very sheltered. Do you mind being a magnet for the paranormal? Asked Etty. Porter paused. Not anymore, but I did when my parents confirmed my uniqueness on my 9th birthday. She recalled her mother fussing over the birthday cake, determined to distract with glazed cherries. Porter had detested cherries ever since. Her father had tried to convince her it was a good thing to be different, while stroking her curls. Once black like his, they had turned white when she was only 6. My mother calls my ability a gift, even though she's terrified of it. I told her I wanted a different gift. Mum wasn't happy. Porter had stabbed a cherry which stained a tablecloth. Her mother had thrown her cake in the bin. Both Porter and her father had recognised the warning sign. Richard bore a scar on his left lobe from one of Patty's moments of displeasure. Porter remembered Patty pouring herself another drink, her response to anything she didn't like. Porter could still hear her father's bleak sigh. And who can blame me? Patty had turned on him. No, don't answer. We both know you do. Her father's insistence that Penny's death was an accident had angered her further. But she should be here, celebrating with us, Patty had cried. You act like you've forgotten her. With so many pictures of her dead twin ornamenting the house, Porter knew that was impossible. And then Patty had asked her the question she had never wanted to hear. Do you see her? Richard was mortified. Don't answer, that wasn't fair. Patty had been suitably contrite. You're afraid that I see her, Patty had stated quietly. No, Porter. I'm afraid that you don't. Patty's confession still haunted Porter. I've had better birthdays, she admitted darkly, stealing Etty's cigarette. Etty was intrigued. Did you inherit your ability? From my mother's side, some inheritance, said Porter. Patty had an old family photograph of a group picnicking. Lunch was scattered across an oversized blanket with the participants framing the edge. Stiff upper lips and starched collars jarred with their setting. No one was smiling. Porter recalled a young girl guarding the hamper. She was wearing a simple white dress like her sister's, but her wistful expression set her apart. Porter recognised her as a spirit who visited her when she was little. Etty trembled, eager to hear more. The ghost would sit on Porter's bed and whisper about the dragon lady. The child had been terrified of her, even in death. Porter's bedroom would stay arctic long after the presence had dwindled, along with the smell of almonds and sometimes a solitary white feather. Who was the dragon lady, darling? An aged relative encased in black crinoline, answered Porter, and the girl was my great-aunt. She was called Dorothy, but everybody knew her as Dotty. She always wore a ribbon in her hair. Mum cried when I told her it was blue. Did Dotty possess the gift, darling? Porter nodded. Along with my great-grandfather. Porter had grown to respect her capabilities in time, but not everyone had been so accommodating. Other children were afraid of her because of her appearance, which hardly helped. She had had a long, lonely childhood with only the shadows for company. Were there others in your family? Asked Etty. My great-grandfather's cousin Samuel, but he died before I was born. I knew my great-grandfather, though. He died when I was 4. Porter had visited him in the hospital days before he passed away. The ward had been old and draughty and reeked of anaesthetic. The matron, whom Porter had misjudged for a guard, had led them to a wizened figure dozing in bed. Porter had thought him dead until the matron pinched his arm. It wasn't a happy memory. They called him the Wireless because he was tuned into more channels than most, stated Porter. Etty paused. And Penny, darling? Porter grew silent. Sorry, I don't mean to pry. You do, said Porter softly, but I don't know if my sister saw things. She died when we were 6 after falling down the stairs. I barely remember her. Etty shivered. Porter's disclosure was delivered without emotion. Porter failed to add that she had caused Penny's death. They had been wrangling over a toy at the top of the stairs when Penny slipped. Panic, adrenaline, and devastation followed. The only thing absent was blame. Porter's parents knew it was an accident, a shocking, appalling, heartbreaking calamity, yet their acceptance had always made her feel worse. An uneasy silence followed. Etty sought refuge in a book while Porter checked her emails. Her former boss Danny Drakeson wanted to know when she was coming back to Anomaly. Porter scoffed. Etty's gaze strayed from her book. What is it, darling? She wasn't surprised to hear Danny was chasing Porter. A little sleuthing had paraded her new flatmate's cult-like status. Countless articles and books were cited, along with the various events she had spoken at. Did Danny give you your nickname, darling? No, that was courtesy of my course tutor, Professor Valens. He thought me a charlatan and was being ironic. Sounds delightful, darling. Porter shrugged. Valens was entitled to his opinion. The jaded old queen did me a favour in the end. He got me the job at Anomaly, and when my first investigation failed spectacularly, he persuaded Danny not to sack me. Etty couldn't imagine Porter failing at anything. Porter was inclined to agree. It was as much a mystery to her now as it was 5 years ago. Her first assignment for Anomaly had sent her to an exclusive address in the heart of Belgravia. Elizabeth Square had flaunted all manner of residents, from viscounts to football legends, both honoured and disgraced. She had been summoned to number 12 by the journalist Paul Mortimer, whose ancestors had purchased the property a mere 250 years ago. Making inquiries about the family before her visit had exposed 2 skeletons in the Mortimer closet. One involved a politician, a plumber, and a goat. The other, the disappearance of Daisy Mortimer. Etty frowned. The teenager who vanished in the 80s? Porter nodded. Daisy's father had reported her missing the day after her 14th birthday. It turned out to be a double tragedy for the Mortimer family. Daisy's twin, Elspeth, had been found dead at the foot of the stairs 2 weeks prior to Daisy's disappearance. Porter had requested to be taken off the case, but when she wouldn't tell Danny why, he had refused. Etty looked appalled. Did they ever find her? No, the police questioned Daisy's father, but nothing came of it. He died of a heart attack soon afterwards, leaving a widow and son. Fast forward 25 years, and Porter had found herself standing outside a white stucco house. Elizabeth Square's central lawn was gated with only a privileged few in possession of a key. Porter had felt uneasy on entering the house. A dark energy seethed, yet Paul had been oblivious. He had been preoccupied with the deadline, so their meeting was brief. His cleaner, Mrs. Wilson, had been experiencing difficulties at the property ever since his mother's death and had pressured him into calling Anomaly. Not one for hysteria, Mrs. Wilson had initially put her disquiet down to being alone in the house. Paul's mother had been housebound for years, so the cleaner was used to having company. The activity had worsened over time. Mrs. Wilson had stuck her heels in, refusing to be bullied by an invisible presence. Well, that was until a paperweight had high-fived her eye. She was also pained by a bite mark on her arm when she came to. Mrs. Wilson had handed in her notice that very day. Paul was stunned. Mrs. Wilson had worked for the Mortimers for over 40 years, and he viewed her as family. His shock had deepened on being presented with a catalogue of mayhem when he asked her why. While sceptical, Paul respected Mrs. Wilson, and he was desperate not to lose her. He had contacted Anomaly. Porter had interviewed Mrs. Wilson after meeting with Paul at her more modest home in Wandsworth. She turned out to be an orderly woman in her 60s, sporting numerous injuries. Her doctor had confirmed that the bite mark was human. Porter thought Mrs. Wilson had been wise to stay away. Whoever was attacking her clearly had no boundaries. Agreeing to investigate, Porter had returned to Elizabeth Square with a colleague and was greeted by that same hostile atmosphere. She had wanted to flee, but the pressure of it being her first case for Anomaly had forced her to stay. That decision had nearly cost Porter her life. "What happened, darling?" asked Etty breathlessly. Porter had been checking a camera in one of the bedrooms when she was suddenly and inexplicably drawn to the stairs. Resistance had proved futile, as an invisible hand steered her towards the top step, while an icy air silenced her scream. A figure emerged seconds before I fell, she said, shivering. Porter knew more than most how lucky she was to be alive. I woke up in hospital with a fractured arm and an unhappy boss. I was disorientated, but compass mentis enough to give my version of events. I refused to go back, but it turned out that wasn't a problem because Paul didn't want me back. Word had got out about his brush with the paranormal, and he wasn't happy. Etty let out a low breath. That's quite a tale. Perhaps you should consider a safer job. What else am I good for? Ghost guiding, darling. You'll be an instant hit. Porter's temperament cringed at the thought. Making feather duvets it is then, said Etty, letting slip that she'd peeked in Porter's chest at the foot of her bed. She'd be more than a little surprised to find it filled with beautiful white feathers. Porter explained her ghostly calling card theory. Etty regarded her. I found a feather in the shop only yesterday, darling. What happened downstairs? Another time, yawned Porter, ready to call it a night.